Hello and welcome to another episode of F1OWC Podcast Live. I'm your host Dylan Anderson, four-time F1OWC champion, joined once again by three-time world champion Brandon Tanti. Welcome.
Hello.
And we are also joined today by our special guest, Mr. Austin Smedley from Rocket Williams Racing. Welcome.
Hi. Hello.
So we're going to run through, obviously we won't have the weather prediction because we've done that in the Tuesday podcast, but we're going to reflect on the Azerbaijan Grand Prix and the Spanish Grand Prix that have just passed, and I have to say they were definitely some eventful races. Brandon,
yes,
give us a run through on your Baku performance, obviously winning the sprint race. Give us a little reflections on that.
I think going to the start of it, I think I felt a bit unfortunate to miss out on the pole there. The superior pace of Oscar, I think, really showed. So I had a bit more work to do to get to the front there. Off the line for the start, but managed to do enough throughout the race. The pace felt pretty good. There's some tricky corners there as well, so especially due to some of the wet conditions we had. It was all about trying to stay on track and not make too many mistakes. So it was good sprint race. The feature race, though, I think was a bit more tricky in itself, even though it was completely dry, wasn't it?
No, the sprint race started in wet.
Oh, the sprint race, but the feature race was dry.
The feature race was dry,
Yeah, so, even though it was dry, it was a bit more difficult race trying to get through to the front there. But, I managed to do a fair bit throughout the whole race, and then got towards the end of it, got up to as far as P2, and then I was ahead in the last lap. I made a bit of a mistake myself going into, I think that's turn 3. Completely misjudged the braking marker there, and just had to go down the escape road. I had to make the decision whether or not I wanted to try and make the corner. I don't think I was, so I went down the escape road, then I couldn't get out of it. It took me good part of, I think, at least 30 seconds, which felt like an eternity to get out. But salvaged some points there, which was good.
Well, I remember watching the mini-map as it was happening, and it was very close. And I know Shannon, who I was in a party chat with at the time, was saying that, Brandon's gone down the escape road, because you and Ryan were pretty close at the time, that maybe there might have been some contact. Obviously, later on you revealed that you simply just misjudged the breaking point. But to actually recover that and recover to P6 and bank 8 points, I think was crucial, given the fact that Ryan would end up going on to win the race under Stewart's penalties.
Yeah, initially, after the race and after the penalties were handed out, it was a bit frustrating that I probably cost myself some more points than initially wanted to get. But
in theory it would have been your race win had the penalties played out as it was and you were ahead of Ryan. It would have been you on the top step of the podium with 25 points.
Yeah, that's right. Difficult to take, but unfortunately, especially with this format, you really have to just move on quickly and focus on the next one, because they're coming so fast that you just need to sort of put it behind you and move forward to the next one. So so I was quick to move on from that and try and focus on the next race, which was Spain. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think the tricky conditions in qualifying and at the start of the race in the sprint race were definitely something that we haven't had to endure in the F1OWC before at Baku. It was obviously different for everyone. Everyone's tiptoeing around trying to find that grip, and I think for the most part, everyone did really well, navigating the castle section and stuff like that. I know Oscar Grant was in front, and they basically dumped it in front of me, in the castle, and sort of had to take a deep breath there and go, oh, because there's nowhere to go. If he's, doesn't ghost and he's a solid car, that's me done.
Yeah.
Go on.
I think also one of the more interesting points was the choice of strategy at the start of that race. Many drivers opting to go for the intermediate tyres instead of the full wets, which I think was a risky call, especially given such slippery conditions and the fact that it was back and the walls are so close.
Well, that's exactly right, and it was very sort of reminiscent of season 9 Singapore with Nathan Mazzolo locking out the front row there at Sauber on the pole, and in a heavy rain race at Singapore elected to start on intermediates and simply just got swallowed. Which happened to a lot of the guys on the grid. Obviously, Oscar Grant, pole sitter on the intermediates, Ryan Lowe, Mitchell Collin, Harry Ryan, who was the highest finish of the intermediate starters, but also our special guest Austin Smedley, starting on the intermediate tyres and being able to hold it out for 3/4 of the race and going on softs there at the end. Austin, if you can just tell us in a few words, what was the deciding factor in starting on intermediate tyres in wet weather conditions?
My idea of starting on the inters at the start in heavy rain conditions was leading up to the race. Me and a few of the guys did some practice runs in race conditions on both the full wets and the inters, and we found that the heavy rain only lasted for the first 3 or 4 laps of the race, and so we found it was probably quicker to go on the intermediates at the start and sort of just slowly work through that heavy rain period, and then go to about lap 10 when the rain stopped and go for the one stop onto the dry tyres.
Yeah, well, I think it was an absolutely smart decision looking back on it. Obviously, with the advantage of hindsight, we saw in Bahrain how long that the intermediate tyres were able to last for the top group of people. Obviously, not pitting at all and just staying out for the whole 14 laps on the intermediate tyres. So there's obviously performance there, and as you said, if you can work your way through without damage in that first couple of laps while it is heavy rain, you'll end up being able to run longer into the race on the intermediates than you would on the wet tyres, as they'd simply burn out. Brandon, looking back at that, obviously you did end up walking away with the race win with a 2-stop strategy from wets, inters to softs.
Yeah.
Looking back at that, would you change your strategy going into that race, or are you pretty content with the safer option?
I think I was pretty content looking back on it. I think I had flashbacks of, like you said, season 9 Singapore, when I saw people with the intermediate tyres. I thought to myself, it's very risky, and I didn't know whether or not it was going to pay off, and I hadn't actually tested it myself. It wasn't a thought that really crossed my mind, probably due to the limited practice that I did have going into it. I just kind of did some wet weather running and made sure that I was at least somewhat consistent on it, and made sure each tyre that I could go on I was good enough to maintain a good pace. But I don't think I would change the decision. I think looking at the way the race turned out, I think getting out in the clean air on the wets, you could see the amount of time that was gained even over those short amount of laps. I think it was like 3 or 4 laps. The gap, I think, between me, Kurt, and I think to the drivers behind Kurt was floating around 10 seconds almost. So, but credit to the drivers that did, like Austin as well, to stick it out on inters, because you essentially save yourself a pit stop if you can survive. But it's very risky. You really got to know what to expect and know that you're going to have a really limited amount of grip, especially if you're running no traction. Going through some of those corners, it's tricky enough as it is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And obviously Austin's starting on the pole in intermediate conditions. He'd gotten swallowed by the front couple of cars. I was right on the back of him going into Castle, and as I said, he just lit up the rears, as you say, with that limited grip. and you know he nearly cost the race. And obviously, if you block the track there at the castle, I think you can cost the race for a lot of people. But Oscar's just commented in and said, you know, his decision to use wet tyres was slightly based on last season's German Grand Prix, where he managed to win in a straight fight with Luke and Ryan after being for Inters under heavy rain conditions. And I think, you know, for the most part, it is a valid reference. But again, you know, the German Hockenheim's a little bit more forgiving in terms of, you know, runoff area and you know, it's not an enclosed street circuit, as so to say. Looking at the feature race, obviously the winner on the day was Shannon Mortlock. However, incident was brought to the steward's attention after the race by Ben Matchett, who effectively felt that, you know, Shannon had thrown it down the inside of him into turn 3, you know, which is you know, fair enough. But ultimately, having the sharper angle, needed to pull it up more, and basically, with Ben sort of trying to hold his position, there was contact made, and then obviously the cars that were all over the back of Ben ultimately ended up going past him as a result of that damage. Shannon Mortlock picked up a 10-second penalty for that incident, as you know, it kept with consistency over the past couple of rounds. What's your take on the impact of Shannon losing his first win at Toro Rosso?
Obviously it hurts. You know, it hurts to lose the win in that sort of fashion, especially when you've won it on track. Like it happened to me in season 11 at Australia. You know,
yeah.
Was it the feature race? Pretty sure.
With Wayne, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, going down into, I think it was turn 3, I just bumped the back of him, and it was enough to send him into the gravel there. And, you know, it took him that long to get out. He effectively came back onto the track last.
Yeah, well, he effectively went from like I think he was running in second at the time, and then ended up coming out, and yeah, as you say, dead last, which obviously massive positional loss for him. And obviously, Yude went on to cross the line and win the race, and you know, that steward's review there. So you get a 10-second time penalty, which, you know, cost you the race win. And obviously there was some comments made throughout the Azerbaijan Grand Prix that, you know, maybe the stewards were biased towards, you know, favouring some drivers. Ultimately, you know, maybe some of these drivers hadn't been around to experience some of those bigger calls where the administrators have had to kind of, you know, review their own incidents and give out the penalties to themselves. Obviously, you've lost the Australian Grand Prix. I've had to disqualify myself in the past. You know, we've disqualified Shannon in the past. You know, so I think that's hopefully, with stripping Shannon of that win, sort of, you know, justifies that, hey, look, you know, we're not here to favour any of the drivers, and not that you know, we penalise Shannon to make a statement out of him. It was just, you know, purely on consistency of what we'd done up to that point. Now ultimately Shannon had thrown it down the inside at turn 10 in Bahrain on Fletcher, you know, caused wing damage to Fletcher. He picked up the penalty. You know, Fletcher got damaged, lost positions, and the same thing happened at China. You know, Shannon had dumped him at the last corner in China. He got the penalty. What's your thoughts on the recent sort of run of these type of penalties being given out? Do you feel that they are justified based on the crime committed, or do you think they need to be looked into?
No, I believe they're pretty justified based on, you know, like I said, the consistency of, you know, all the incidents we've reviewed in the past and all the collection of incidents we've had, not just this season but also last season and seasons before that. You know, and I think we've always stuck to the, you know, the method of looking at the incident itself and not at the driver. So, you know, we're not looking at individual people for what they've done. We're isolating it to the incident in particular and what that means and the outcome of that and how, whether or not it's deserving of a penalty, or whether or not it should be let go as a racing incident.
No, that's
yeah.
exactly right. And and another penalty that was given out to Shannon in the Chinese Grand Prix was his sort of breach of snaking on the back straight, if we're going to call it that, which is basically simply he's weaving from left to right to left to right to break the toe of the cars behind him. Ultimately, he has been penalised for that in the past at the Baku Grand Prix, from memory, which is basically what brought this into play, was the fact that, and I think also too, at that time in Baku, it was highlighted by the fact that he was running cockpit and you couldn't really see the car next to you and the gap to the wall, and it was contact made, I think, don't quote me from memory, with Oscar. I could be wrong there, but there was contact made with someone, and then that's why we brought in that snaking infringement. Austin, you were one of the guys in the chat there that, along with Fletcher and that were pretty adamant that needed to be brought to the steward's attention. What part of that snaking scenario down the back straight didn't sit well with you guys in that chat?
Well, I vividly remember Oscar doing the same thing in Spain last season, weaving down the main straight, and I picked him up there, and then seeing Shannon do it at China down the back straight brought back that memory, and I said to the guys that it's a legitimate rule in any form of motorsport that you're only allowed to move once off the racing line and then back onto the racing line again in a straight line. And Shannon went right and left about 3 times down the length of that back straight, and every time he weaved off the racing line, it just made me more and more frustrated, and kept saying,
naturally, as you would. Like, I was at the back of that train watching, the cars go from left to right to left to right, on and off the dirty parts of the track. Ultimately, he's there to try and break toe at the sort of disadvantage to the guys behind him. Naturally, he wants to do well, but as you said, you're permitted to move once to defend and then basically come back to the racing line, providing that you leave a car's width either side of the track. Hadn't been in the chat with him at the time, it was sort of seen as a little bit comedic. That's why when it was brought forward, I was like, you're going to get a penalty for that. When I'd sort of reminded him that he had been penalised for it in the past, he was like, well, yeah, okay, fair enough. I should have, done a bit more to sort of not do that. And for the most part, throughout that feature race, I'm sure everyone was looking at everyone's movements all through the pack going down that back straight. Ryan's just commented in, goes, is there any plans of introducing a penalty point system in future to prevent drivers from continually causing incidents across a whole season? I think that's a valid point. In the past, yes, we have had penalty point systems. We've had like a whole, 30-page regulation document, effectively. Me and Brandon spent like 2-3 weeks putting it together, and it had the breakdown of what penalty was given for what infringement, and then basically how many of those infringements you could build before you were given a race ban, and if you got X amount of race bans, you got booted out. Ultimately, yeah, I think there's been some incidents so far in season 12 that may be a little bit questionable. We're not oblivious to those, but again, it comes back to what Brandon and myself have spoken about in previous podcasts, that there are people that have only done 10-12 races going up against people that have done 50 to 70 Grand Prix. Now, you will always have you know, and I stand by the statement that you will always have a disadvantage when you're trying to, you know, learn either the game, you know, people that aren't accustomed to league racing, racing with these other people. Like, I know myself, I can go wheel to wheel with Brandon, you know, on the streets of Monaco, and we'll leave each other sufficient space. But that's because I've raced with Brandon for, you know, over 120 Grand Prix. Yeah, I think Ben Matchett and Mitchell Hayward have found themselves in you know, some questionable scenarios in season 12. Are they totally to blame? No. You know, do they need to take some of it? Of course. But you can't, you know, come in and just say, hey, look, these guys are, you know, reckless and they're bumping into me and they're dive bombing and, you know, they're hitting people, they're costing me points. You know, what they're doing may be wrong, but you've also got to look at yourself as an individual to say, okay, I know what that person's like. How can I change my racecraft to get around them as efficiently and safely as possible? You know, ultimately, you can't expect that car just to jump out of your way. And if you know that they're going to defend you tooth and nail into the corner, and they may be, you know, driving the shallower line into the corner, there's always ways to get the better traction, get the better run. I know I did it on Ben Matchett in turn 5. And he messaged me after the race, and he's like, how the hell did you get bloody that much acceleration out of the corner? And I just see overtake on the ERS and high fuel. And obviously he's still running auto on an ERS, so he's always going to be at a deployment disadvantage. So if other drivers on the grid can use that to get past him in a more efficient way, then, you know, it's better for everyone, rather than expecting him to just, you know, jump out of the way. What are your thoughts on that, Brandon?
Yeah, I think I agree with, you know, what you're saying. You know, there's always going to be instances where, you know, especially in a feature race, where, you know, the grid is mixed, and the expectations you may have, you know, to score big points, you know, can change depending on how you approach the race, how you approach, you know, overtaking drivers, certain drivers compared to others. You know, albeit, you know, most of the racing we've seen has been pretty good. But at the same time, you know, motor racing, you're always going to see incidents, and, you know, it's all about thinking about how you adjust yourself, like you said, you know, going into, you know, a race, you know, coming up against other drivers, how you're going to deal with that. You know, and the more, you know, for me, the more, you know, you race with someone, certain people, you get an idea of how, you know, how they go about racing, how they look to defend, how they, you know, where they're strong, you know, and sometimes it takes a bit longer to understand, especially at particular tracks, to understand, you know, if you spend a lap behind someone, you can pretty quickly work out where you're faster than someone, where you're faster than someone, where they're faster than you. You know, sometimes it takes just a little bit, you know, a level of patience to understand how to get past someone.
Yeah. So. I fully agree with that, and, you know, ultimately I think a lot of these sort of question marks have been raised by, you know, several drivers in the paddock about, you know, Ben's sort of style of over defending everything, whether that be in a practice, on an outlap, qualifying, the race, you know, lap down, whatever it may be. We understand that. We're aware of it. You know, we will be speaking with Ben in terms of dialing down his defending during practice and in qualifying, for sure. You know, there's no need for it. It puts himself and everyone else at risk. In terms of in the race, if he's not a lap down, why should he have to be put in a position of yielding the place? You know, whether or not he's a front-running driver or a midfield-running driver or a back-running driver, you know, why should he just automatically jump out of the way to suit a certain individual, you know, or whoever it may be? Like, Steve's been around with us for over 100 races, you know, he's not the fastest driver in the world, but if you come up behind him during the race, are you expecting Steve to jump out of the way? You know, you can't have a double standard. You know, Mitchell's picked up a hatful of points this season for Haas. You know, Ben's got points. I think these guys are progressively getting better. Yes. You know, obviously Mitchell's made some changes to his the field of view that he races in, which we touched on before. Yeah, but that's racing, essentially. But we're going to segue into the Spanish Grand Prix briefly. Big weekend for Renault. Big weekend for Mr. Brandon Tanti, picking up pole position, first in the Renault colours, ahead, nearly 2 tenths ahead of Shannon Mortlock, and 4 tenths ahead of his teammate Kurt Dunn. Just give us some feedback there on you know, your pole position run and what it felt like to get the pole position for Renault.
To be honest, it felt really good, especially because of the fact that I was really hunting for one. You know, particularly over the past few rounds prior to Spain. You know, missing out on the pole, you know, by a tenth or a little bit here and there, gets a little bit, gets to you a little bit, and you think, can you do it? And I think, Spain was one of those tracks where, as soon as I started doing practice on it, I felt pretty confident. It was just one of those tracks that I really clicked with, and really, I didn't have a lot of practice going into it, but it just all clicked really well for me. And I think, working out the setup was, I think, really good, especially over the race. Managed to keep the tyres in really well and put in consistent laps, within a tenth or two of each other. So, to maintain that was really good. But for the pole itself, that really felt special. So.
Yeah, beautiful. Obviously, it was a very difficult practice session, I should say, and qualifying for a lot of the drivers on the grid. Obviously, I found the wall a few times. Austin was tagged by Kurt on the back straight, found the gravel. But there was a lot of question marks when you started putting in super fast times on the medium tyres. Did you do that to try and sort of make a statement to say, hey, look, this is the pace I've got, and sort of get into the head of the other guys, or what was your intentions behind that?
Oh, not particularly. I just, it was more of a situation where I thought, I didn't really want to show too much pace on the softs, so I thought I'll give it a crack on the mediums to see what I can do. Wasn't expecting to set a time that fast, but that lap in itself felt, just as good, or if not better, than the qualifying lap that I did. That got me pole. So it was really good. I don't think it was in the end it looked like it was setting a statement, but in the end it was good. I was just going through the program and making sure that I was getting ready for qualifying in the right way. So that was part of it. Getting an idea of what the grid was like and where I could push the limits a little bit. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Toro Rosso was looking to do a couple of toes in qualifying, but we ended up butchering that, and I ended up getting a broken wing and ruined it. I only managed to get in a good lap at the end, and I think I just out-qualified yourself, Austin. Difficult start of the race for both of us. Ultimately being swallowed by a couple of cars going through the first sector, and then ultimately myself spinning. Wasn't ideal way to start the race. What's your recap on the sprint race or the Spanish Grand Prix, Austin?
The sprint race was not one to. It was one to figure out for myself. Obviously not qualifying as well as I would expect to. And I put that all down to the setup. I just couldn't find the balance between straight line speed and downforce. And just didn't really get going in the sprint race and fell back, and then moved up a spot, and then in the pit stops I followed Fletcher Sermon into the pits, and he broke slightly earlier than I was expecting. I straight away jumped on the brakes and couldn't pull it up in time, and ended up breaking my front wing going into the pit lane, which cost me dearly.
Yeah.
Definitely a tough one to swallow.
Yeah, definitely cost me a handful of points in that race.
I've been in the position of that as well, where I've come in and rocked up too hot, or you brake at your normal reference point and end up demolishing someone into the pits. I know Fletcher ended up getting a penalty for that. I think from memory we overturned it. You ended up finishing P7 in the sprint race, picking up 6 points for Rocket Williams Racing. Mitchell Collin P5, 10 points. So there's a pretty good 16 points there in the. Sorry, that's in the Baku. What am I on about? Yeah, P9 in the sprint race for yourself, Mitchell Collin in P7, and the retirement in the feature race going into the back straight there. Do you want to just explain to the guys listening in what led to that retirement?
Well, it was all down to trying to catch up on lost time, really. Just trying to push that little bit extra to try and catch the pack, and got too far wide on the curb, and curb just ate me up and spat me out, and into the wall I went.
Yeah, I've definitely done that a few times in winter testing. Even today, on the day in qualifying practice, I found myself out there on the gravel. I know, Brandon, you've been out there a couple of times in winter testing in the past. It's definitely an unforgiving part of the track, but it requires absolute commitment.
It definitely does. I find Spain's interesting, because when you approach the track itself, you think maybe I need a bit less downforce for the straight, but really there's only really one straight, and then the rest of it's really high-loaded corners, long corners, and a few. You've got a hairpin and a couple of short corners at the end of the lap. But because of how demanding it is on the tyres, I felt you need to run more aero than you actually expect to run, particularly for the race, because if you're running lower aero, you get in a situation where you get a lot of understeer and the tyres start sliding and they start overheating, which starts ruining your race pace, because once the tyres get hot, they basically become almost rubbish to drive on. What I've noticed anyway.
Yeah, that's right. It's definitely, when I heard what set up you guys at Renault with Gorman, I was kind of like, that doesn't seem right, because as you say, traditionally you'd want to run medium to low aero, as you say, with the straights. But you're absolutely valid that there's more undulating high-speed corners than there is straights. But I think what's good about the sprint race and the feature race is that Oscar Grant was able to get back onto the podium, finishing P3 in the sprint, P2 in the feature. Obviously on the back of a difficult day for the championship leader Ryan Lowe. Obviously for Oscar on the back of a difficult Azerbaijan Grand Prix. What do you take of Oscar's double podium return to form?
From what I've seen, especially the chat, he seems pretty chuffed. Going into it, picking up big points, especially on the back of some difficult rounds that he's had. I think not just Baku, I think especially Australia, he had a difficult run there for both races, getting spun in the same corner. But I think he's building the momentum and showing what he can actually really do. He's a very strong driver. I don't doubt, that he's really in for more of this sort of consistency and results, going into the future.
I think it's fantastic for him. I think it's a great way to get his season back on track. I was sort of made aware that there may have been some comments and discussions between the two McLaren guys, and after the end of the sprint race, it's difficult when the front pack of drivers is so close, and yourself sailing away in the front of the race. It's difficult to, you'd think you might be able to get some cheap points by potentially having your teammate let you ahead. What's your thoughts on team orders, Brandon? Especially given that Oscar was able to rebound and take 2 podiums in Spain. Do you think that this question may be asked as the season continues to go on?
Team orders especially is very hard when you have 2 very competitive drivers in
Which
the
we
same
mentioned
team.
before,
Yeah, so it's always difficult, to have that sort of discussion. It's sort of one you have to have. It's situational sometimes, because you really don't know at any point in a race when you might need it. You might need some help, or at the same time, your teammate doesn't have to yield for you if they don't want to. They're in a race just as much as you are, and they want to score points just as much as you. So it's an even playing field when it comes to that, and you can't always expect your teammate to let you through even though you want to, and sometimes you're going to have to earn it. And I think, I believe it's a similar situation with myself and Kurt. He doesn't have to yield for me if he doesn't want to. But if he decides with himself to make the decision to let me through, then I'll happily take it. And, I thank him for it. And if the situation was opposite, I'll do the same for him. So.
Well, ultimately, you guys had a similar arrangement with Kurt leading the Australian Grand Prix, despite you being on the quicker compound and catching him.
Yeah.
But then obviously Kurt was in a position ahead of you in throughout the Spanish Grand Prix, and he opted to let you through. I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think there's positives and disadvantages to team orders. It just depends on that you execute them at the appropriate time, and that it goes both ways. But I think for Kurt Dunn, on the back of an atrocious Chinese Grand Prix, to back up, get some good points, 2 4th place finishes in Spain.
Yeah.
He appears to have gotten his connection issues under control.
Yep.
What's his mindset in the Renault garage after these good runner performances in Baku and Spain?
I believe it's much more positive now. I think it's just a matter of, Kurt finding that little bit of extra pace that he needs. He shows that the pace he has at the moment is still very good. And I think he's just hunting for that little bit extra, just to touch, that little bit extra he needs to get amongst some of the other drivers who have a bit more pace, especially during the race. I think consistency throughout a race is something that he particularly struggles in, and something that he knows that's an issue, and it's something that he's working on. And I'm doing my best to help him with that. So I think it's very positive at the moment. He's happy, especially after the events of China, to pick up the points that he has. So it's really good.
Yeah, I think the big story coming out of Barcelona is in the feature race with Fletcher Sermon picking up his first podium finish in the F1OWC after debuting in Season 9. Everyone, including us, were absolutely, chuffed for him, but there's massive clouds over that result after some interesting driving into Turn 1, which ended up being reviewed after the race. Obviously, there was contact between himself and Ben Matchett, the exit of Turn 2, which resulted in Ben spinning across the pack, which obviously damaged a bunch of drivers and put a lot of people out of contention. He was obviously, based on the consistency that we dished out penalties to Shannon and Shannon and other people in the past, that he got the 10-second penalty because there was contact, there was damage, and there was loss of position. As much as it killed me as an admin and yourself, obviously, for historical reasons, for Fletcher to pick up his first podium, I think it was phenomenal. And to be put in a position as an admin where we needed to take that away from him was not a decision that was made lightly. And I can't emphasise that any more clearer. And I know Fletcher feels really hard done by, and I know there may be some people in the paddock that may question, taking his first podium finish away from him. But if we didn't punish or penalise Fletcher for his contact, then it goes against what we've done to Shannon, it goes against what we've done to other people already throughout the season. That's cost them critical finishes in a Grand Prix. Like Shannon lost the race win in Baku for making contact. So for us to not penalise Fletcher would basically go against everything that we've done up to this point. I think it was really important, and it was one of those difficult big decisions that the F1OWC administrators had to make, even if it went against the grain of public opinion. Because I know that Fletcher and Bennett had come out and said, there was no hard feelings towards each other, which may be fine, but Ben's car went across the pack and multiple people hit him and broke their wings and ruined. So it may be fine with Ben and Fletcher, but it's not with the other 4 or 5 people behind them that got caught up in it. That's where we are with that. But ultimately, we're going to look into the championship points here, as we are getting pretty tight for time. Brandon Tanti moves ahead, P1, 186 points ahead of Ryan Lowe, as we said, had a shocker in Spain. Oscar Grant moves up with his double podium finish into P3 ahead of Mitchell Collin, who is on 97 points. Shannon Mortlock, big effort there for Toro Rosso, double podium finish on 94 points. Kurt Dunn, another good result for him, 2 P4s, 93 points. Harry Ryan, P7, 92 points. There's only a handful of points there between those guys. Really good for Harry to get his season back on track after that double DNF in China. That definitely destroyed his momentum there, but hopefully he can get back on track. Oster Smedley, P8, 81 points. Obviously Spain was a bit tougher than some of the races prior to that. Myself, Dylan Anderson, Toro Rosso, 57 points. Fletcher Sermon on 26 points. Steve Shadlow, 13 points. Tied with Mitchell Hayward, also on 13 points. Ben Matchett on 1 point. Trent Fuller on 0. So we have a bit of announcement to make before we segue into some more comments from Austin. That I was having some discussions with a certain individual after the Spanish Grand Prix. Now Brandon doesn't even know about this, but it has been made official that some discussions were made with Steve Shadlow and his departure from Maranello. He feels that he is too competitive with Fletcher Sermon, which ends up resulting in those guys being in contact with each other a lot. And he feels that he would be better and more consistent playing a reserve, second driver role. So it has been announced that there'll be an immediate switch for Steve Shadlow to replace Trent Fuller at Aston Martin Red Bull Racing alongside Harry Ryan. And Trent Fuller will be returning to Ferrari for the 250th Grand Prix at Monaco. So,
this is a surprise to me. I didn't even know this.
Yeah. So for the series founder, with Trent Fuller making his return in a Ferrari at the 250th Grand Prix, ultimately that's a decision that I had to take, some serious thought on. Obviously, Steve was adamant that he could feel that he could get better performance within himself playing a second driver to Harry Ryan, as opposed to being on equal terms with Fletcher Sermon and battling for those points together. So big statement there. Austin debuted in Season 8 Australia. Obviously that was very difficult for the F1OWC, as we took a little bit of a sabbatical after the Daniel Ryan, or some of you guys may know, Dubsy incident in Australia, where he basically cracked it after the end of the Season 7 series, because all of the cars were already allocated for the upcoming season, and he elected to crash into everyone at the Australian Grand Prix. He picked up a life ban. Yourself, Austin, had one race start, one DNF, which is fair enough. Returned in Season 9 to replace Peter Dongo at the Mexican Grand Prix. Qualified on the front row in the Ferrari, went on to pick up your first podium. Got the pole to win in Brazil in Season 9, which was obviously your first pole to win. So in those 3 races in Season 9, you'd had 2 podiums, a win and a pole. You were my teammate briefly at McLaren. Obviously that partnership didn't play out as everyone would have liked. But to back it up, in Haas, 4 podiums in Season 11 out of 35 races. We'd consider Season 11 as your first full-time season. And obviously now partnering up with Mitchell Collin at Rocket Williams Racing, already 4 podiums out of 10 races. How do you feel, Austin, that's, compared to previous seasons where you may or may not have had a teammate for the majority of that season, how has it affected your ability to go racing, knowing that you've got such a competitive teammate in Mitchell?
Well, having a season champion as teammate is, it's amazing how much I've been able to push myself even further, to lengths that I didn't even know was possible. But having a teammate is definitely something that I've had to adapt to, that I've had to work strategies around. Me and Mitchell are on great terms at the moment, talking strategy and stuff like that, and setups, and just having that ability, having a teammate, having someone there in the other side of the garage to push you to further that you ever thought you could.
That's exactly right. I know the advantages of having a teammate and not having a teammate. As you said, you can collaborate on setup, and even if it doesn't go as far as that, you know that the first person you want to beat in the race is your teammate. And I think the chemistry down at Rocket Williams Racing is fantastic in Season 12, and as you guys got high praise from Brandon and myself in previous podcasts. Obviously double podium finish, history being made there in China, which is phenomenal, ending 169 Grand Prix drought since Williams' last double podium finish. How did that moment feel for you, given that you picked up a podium with your new teammate?
That was an astonishing moment for not only myself and Mitchell, but for the whole team, and everyone back at the factory that worked so hard on the car after a difficult weekend in Bahrain, to come back and smash out a 2-3 on the podium in the feature race was astounding. I managed to keep my nose clean. Mitchell didn't get so lucky at the start, put him at the back, and for him to come back and get P3 was, he was over the top with that recovery drive.
Well, as Brandon and myself, we mentioned on Tuesday, is that Mitchell getting that damage, and obviously the safety car hurt him a little bit, but for him to go from effectively back of the grid all the way up to podium is, as you said, testament to be able to go through in the reverse grid races. And again, Brandon, in Spain, you're coming from dead last, coming through to win the race in the reverse grid races. Again, it was fantastic. Yeah, I think what you guys are doing at Williams this season is really great. You're currently sitting in P3, 178 points in the constructors. 27 points ahead of Toro Rosso, 100 points behind McLaren. I think there's going to be a very tight battle between us guys at Toro Rosso and you guys at Williams for P3 in the championship. I think that's the way it's gonna play out at this stage. But I think the transition that you've had, ultimately since debuting back in Season 8 Australia with the DNF, then to come back and take a podium, a win and a pole as basically a sort of reserve driver at Ferrari after Season 6 champion Peter Dongo announced his retirement. I think that was a big statement, and I think it was proof to yourself that you were able to come in and race with the front running pack of Nathan and Brandon and Brian at that time. But I think getting a full 35 race season under your belt at Haas, despite the fact that you had no teammate to pick up 4 podiums for them in a single season, I think is really good. And then ultimately, as you said, at one point this season you'd had 3 podiums out of 6 races, and I think all of that development that you've had over the previous few seasons, I think it's all that development is paying off, and I think there's no reason at all that you can't get any more podiums this season. And the same with Mitchell. He proved to himself that he still has the ability to win races and get podiums, and I think that extra motivation and that confidence will just continue to grow as the season goes. Brandon, Monaco, track that you've won on numerous occasions, and myself, I've won it 3 times with Red Bull. What's your thoughts on the circuit de Monaco?
It's definitely a bit of a change for Spain. Looking at Monaco itself, it's just such a unique track. The way you prepare for it is completely different. Everyone, I think, will be really pushing to get the pole there because it's so important. To have the clean air, sense of the fact that you really struggle to overtake. It's the most difficult track to make overtakes on because there's basically no viable spot to do it. Even on the small straight you don't really have much time to get one done. If you manage to get in a position to do it.
And the people around you have that tactical awareness to not shut the door on you.
Yeah, well that's another thing as well. The racing's going to be so close, so I think it's part of it's going to be a matter of surviving, and also pushing for pole, especially because qualifying is going to be wet in the beginning and looking to dry out at the end. But my question is whether or not the track will be completely dry at the end of qualifying. Is anyone's guess, really.
Well, I think you'd nearly want to almost go out and do a banker lap on Inters, just to get, because as you said, there may be some people willing to just sit out and wait for the track to dry. But if the track doesn't dry enough, that intermediate banker lap may be very critical to where you start the sprint race. Obviously, we have had wet rain here before. We had intermediate conditions in Season 3, and heavy rain for the entire race in Season 4, which my teammate at Mercedes, Brenton Ross, won, and I had come second. It was 1-2 for Mercedes there, so that was good for them. It's as the guys all well know, that Monaco's my favourite track on the calendar. I still hold my Season 9 Grand Prix win, 100% race, first win on no TC, obviously on the wheel, to do 100% race at Monaco and not break a wing, broke the lap record 3 times in practice up to qualifying. I hold that Season 9 Monaco race higher than my championships. I don't think I will ever surpass that. I think that's the pinnacle of my career. Despite being around for nearly 250 Grand Prix, I can't emulate that, and I don't unless we ran another 100% Monaco race. I don't think, for me personally, nothing will top that.
Well, I think I know something in particular that others may not know, that particularly in qualifying for that particular race, was at a party with Dylan at the time, and it was quite verbally frustrated as you missed out on the pole due to I think you had some traffic on your lap, which kind of cost you some of that extra time you needed to set the pole there.
Yeah, that's right. I was on a good run. Obviously, 3 practice sessions prior to that. Up to that point, I'd held the lap record from season 2. I broke it in practice 1, broke it again in practice 2 and 3. Obviously, top favourite to do well, come out in qualifying. My first lap got impeded by Brian Cruz, and then I was like, oh, okay, come back in. Went out for another run in qualifying, and then it got impeded by Kane Hoggard, and then ultimately ended up having to settle for P2. Brian, who was one of the guys that ended up, out qualifying me, impeded me, I should say, he ended up getting the pole with a time that I knew I could demolish, which was very, very frustrating. And as you mentioned, I was fuming. One of probably the rare moments that I'd actually cracked it to that point, but I was able to turn that around and use that sort of sense of being pissed off in the race. And Brian pulled away. He was obviously slower, and I was all over his gearbox. And as I've said to you, many times in the past, I was in the mindset that I was going to overtake him, or we were going to have a crash. And that's how the belief that I had in myself that I'd been robbed. I knew that I could get past him. It was like on lap 2 or 3, Brian actually ended up yielding the position into Tabac because he was all over the back of me. I was all over the back of him, and as I said, I was going to force the overtake, or we're both having a crash. And he ended up getting out of the way, and then I took off into the sunset. I think I opened up like 20-second gap, and to the point where I'd actually 2-stopped the race, come back on the ultra softs there, chased down Lindsay, who did a 1-stop, ended up pressuring him like I did to Brian, and then he ended up running deep into Raskas, broke his wing, and then I come through and won the race with like 10 laps to go. So it was a different race, but as I said, like, to do 78 laps of Monaco that fast, that consistent and not break a wing, phenomenal. It won't ever be beaten. But guys, we're out of time. Thank you all for joining in. I hope you all enjoyed the content from tonight, and I'd like to see the fallout of everyone's comments on Steve leaving Ferrari. I think that's juicy, and much love to him, and good luck at his return to Ferrari. So thank you, Brandon Tanti, for joining us tonight, and our special guest, Mr. Austin Smedley. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure.
And we will see you on Saturday for Monaco.
See you guys.